Portugal's NHR tax incentive is one of the best known tax incentives in the world right now. And yet if you're a millionaire or you're a high earner, it may not be the best deal for you. I'm going to run down a number of different considerations and tell you how to choose the best tax incentive in Europe. So if you're not familiar with Portugal's NHR system, it's basically a 10-year tax incentive for people who have not lived in Portugal before or recently. You can go there and you can get dramatically lower rates, and in some cases you don't have to pay anything at all on many different types of income and investment. Now if you have a salary, that's not going to be quite as advantageous, but if you're running a business, many people don't even know that you can get rates down into the single digits, and so it's definitely one to consider, but it's not for everyone. If it's your first time here, I'm Andrew Henderson, founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, from lowering your taxes to improving your lifestyle to having options with things like second citizenship. You never can have too many options in a crazy world as we have today. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. So a lot of folks who are living in Portugal think that they cannot use companies in other jurisdictions to reduce their taxes. And this is where the NHR gets a little bit dicey, because I'm not giving you tax advice here, and everyone's situation is different, of course, so I don't want to speak too specifically. But generically, there are people, depending on how you run your business, depending on who's running the business can be incorporated somewhere else in Europe, and you can do the proper tax planning. There must be tax planning with Portugal. As I've said, it's the Swiss cheese of tax incentives, and so you have to have planning, but you can potentially pay tax rates in the single digits if you structure things properly and if you follow some rules. I told you I had a friend who's living in Portugal who thought his company had to be paying like 25% tax. And I'm like, that's not what you have to do, but you have to follow some systems. So you can get your tax rate down to, somewhere in the mid single digits. However, then you look at, okay, what are my other options in Europe? I can go to Italy. If I'm single, I can pay 100,000 euros lump sum. Greece has a similar program with some more hoops to jump through. Switzerland, it's going to cost me more. Depending on what my citizenship is, it costs me a lot more. You've got non-dom countries, Ireland, Malta, Cyprus, in Europe that you can take advantage of, right? For some people, not most, you can take advantage of Estonia's corporate system, where you just basically pay when the money is distributed. Probably not good for most businesses, but occasionally is a good deal. And so when you start to compare, hey, if I make $3 million in Portugal, considering the dollar and the euro are pretty much at par now, hey, I'm going to pay 50% more tax than I would living in Italy or living, somewhere else. I might pay 75% more tax than I would living in Ireland, where I have more control, right? Where I'm either paying a flat amount or I'm controlling how much tax I pay based on a remittance model, right? And so if you spend most of what you earn, then Portugal may be better. If you make less than 2 million euros, Portugal may be better. But people, I think that because Portugal has this very popular NHR tax program, that's the only option. And what I want you to know is you've got, again, lump sum programs, non-dom programs available to you. What I would also consider is, do I want to live in Europe at all? And so obviously, if I can live in a country like Malaysia, instead of my company, the UAE, I can just potentially have a 000 tax system. Europe is never going to be that way. Europe is generally going to say, hey, again, pay us 100,000 a year, make all you want. Hey, only pay us on the money that you bring into the country, and then so that you control what it costs you to live, which is why, again, if you're living on dividends from a company that Portugal allows you to have your business incorporated in, that can be better, okay? And so the other challenge that I see in Portugal is, number one, with their blacklist, where there's certain places your business can't be incorporated. Someone like myself who moved there, we have companies set up in places like the UAE, Hong Kong, the US, that would generally be on Portugal's blacklist. And so that means that I'm going to pay a penalty rate. I don't want to restructure my entire business to move there. So if you're just starting out and you have the ability to structure your business any way you want, and you want to go through this more complicated structuring, and you're willing to pay a single-digit rate, and you're willing to follow some rules, then Portugal could work. But again, if you're going to pay 5 or 6%, and you're going to have to go through, in those jurisdictions that are not blacklisted, you're going to have to go through more audit procedures, you're going to have to provide more paperwork, there's going to be more ongoing effort, that's going to have a toll, that's going to have a time cost, that's going to have an actual cost, that could be unappealing, right? And so what I look at is, how much money am I making, and what's my tax rate going to be in a non-dom jurisdiction, in a lump sum jurisdiction, and in a place like Portugal that has an exemption, okay? Now, I don't necessarily look at the time frame, because in 10 years, who of us knows where we're going to be living, right? In 10 years, when they start charging you the normal taxes, you're on to the next place, right? Because the lump sums don't always last forever. The non-doms can eventually go away. And so if you want to live in Europe, you have to accept that you might be moving around every 10 years if your sole goal is reducing taxes, right? So the other factor then is, again, how much money am I making and what's my rate in each of those different jurisdictions? If you're making more than a couple million dollars a year, you're probably going to find Portugal to not be as competitive. Again, you're going to find things like certain capital gains, certain incomes not treated as well as they would be in one of those other types of jurisdictions. And so you want to analyze that. A lot of folks who have different kinds of incomes, who have different kinds of gains, are not going to be treated as well in a country like Portugal, on top of the fact that, again, you've got to work with a more limited list of resources than you would, let's say, in Italy, okay? Where you have more flexibility in where the company is set up, right? In Italy's system, you want to have your company in a UAE free zone, you can. And so now you've got lower tax cost, and you've got a lower ongoing maintenance cost because there's really no audit work to do in most of the free zones, right? But so besides the financials and besides the actual effort in doing this, you have to ask yourself, if I'm living in Portugal long enough to be deemed a tax resident, is that more free? If I'm looking at freedom, right? We talk about freedom, finance, and lifestyle. Is Portugal more free than another country in the European Union? I don't think Portugal is terrible. I don't know that it's also that much different than other countries that have tax incentives. So that's probably a push. What's the lifestyle? Okay, in Portugal, I was in Lisbon recently. Everyone speaks English. People are friendly. It's not the most developed place in the world, but it has a lot of Western comforts. If you're looking for shopping malls on every corner, you're not going to have that as you would in, let's say, Asia or in Dubai or what have you. But you've got a lot of nice places to live. Lots of Americans are going there and they're really enjoying it. So on freedom, you've got to make a determination. On lifestyle, you've got to make a determination. On citizenship, which to me is an extra benefit of living somewhere, if you're going to put in the time to where you're a tax resident and you're actually going to spend part of your life in a country, can I get citizenship? And so in that regard, Portugal is going to be more flexible. And so if you're making $1 million a year, then maybe Portugal's a better deal and you won't have that much work potentially for your company to go through the audits and deal with the hassles of being in the whitelisted jurisdictions Portugal has. If you make more than that, if you're making $3 million a year, and you say, hey, you know what, I'd rather pay a little bit more in Portugal because I can get citizenship more easily. If you're willing to learn conversational Portuguese, you're going to have to spend a little bit less time in Portugal than you would, let's say, Ireland to become naturalized, right? So Ireland, they speak English. You don't have to learn a new language to become naturalized, but they're going to require, if you want citizenship in the same 5-year residence period, to spend more time, substantially more time in the country. You're not going to be doing much traveling outside of Ireland. And Ireland not being in the Schengen area, right? They know every time you leave Ireland, right? I mean, I'm not saying, cut, but I'm saying, certainly Portugal, you've got a bit more flexibility. But you've got to learn the language. A country like Italy, right? You're not going to get citizenship in 5 years, but you're going to get it in 10 years. So they're more flexible, but it's a longer period of time. And again, you're going to need to learn some conversational Italian. So you have to learn, if you're going to go to Europe, what I would look at is, what's the complexity of the tax structure? Portugal's going to be more complex, especially for high earners. What's the actual cost? Well, due to that complexity, Portugal's going to cost more, and there's a break-even point somewhere in the low 7 figures where you'd be better off going somewhere else, right? And so then you want to look at, well, if I'm going to live somewhere, what's the lifestyle, what's the freedom? That's up to you to factor in. We talk to people about that we work with all the time. But what's the citizenship, right? Am I willing to learn a language? Have been talking to more folks recently that are a little bit older. No, we're not looking to learn a language, right? And their businesses are very successful, and their businesses in other countries may not work as well with Portugal's structure, by the way. Even in the United States, it may require some restructuring to where you may have to, in some cases, make your business, if it's overseas, all right, so let's say you're leaving behind a business in the U.S., there may be some times when you need to make that less tax efficient for U.S. purposes in order to comply with what's happening in Portugal. And so if that's the case, then that's a strike against it, right? Because not everyone is moving a business that is living in the cloud, essentially, to anywhere in the world. Some people still have businesses in other countries, and that may not always work with Portugal. But the citizenship is faster, is a bit more flexible, but does require a language. So these are the things that you have to think about. What I want you to know is, okay, programs that aren't as well marketed, right? You don't hear that much about Italy in comparison, at least I don't in the Western world. You don't hear as much about Ireland or Cyprus. You hear a decent amount about Malta, but Malta's program, I think people find it to be very confusing, right? Look at all these different programs in Europe, and then consider whether Europe is only the place to be. And so these are the factors. I'm not convinced that a Malta or a Cyprus gives citizenship quite as easily as a country like Portugal, but I think it's theoretically possible to get there. And so this is what you're looking at when you're figuring out, hey, I'm moving my business. Can my business be moved overseas at all, or am I leaving it behind? How does it affect a blacklist in a European country, which wouldn't exist in most other parts of the world when I'm going and taking advantage of a tax incentive? And what's my actual money going to be paid? And so if you follow those criteria, a lot of folks just aren't going to work out Portugal. And again, the breaking point for me is low 7 figures, especially if you've already got your citizenship covered somewhere else.